Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is the first Warlock build for Season of the Wish, and it's one I'm very excited to share with you because it's one of my favorite playstyles currently on Warlock, and it's an updated version of a Strand Warlock build I showed off in Lightfall that has only gotten better with time. Some brief highlights of the build include constant unraveling and suspending effects, as well as a ton of threadling generation, and the nice thing with this build is you don't even need to use Strand weapons to have it all work out. In fact, you can combine a bunch of different weapons depending on their own effects, as well as the artifact mods, and have a variety of different subclass effects, all enhancing Strand Warlock's already fantastic kit. For example, I have constant devour and radiant on my Warlock, and you can take this a bunch of different directions depending on what you want your playstyle to be. In addition to this, we have a ton of weapon support and orb gen, which allows us to enhance ourselves and our fire team, and this is a build that is handcrafted for endgame content. I've been using Strand Warlock with a similar build for past seasons for stuff like GMs and master raids, and whenever GMs do release in this season, I'm 100% going to be using this exact build whenever I take Warlock into it. Before we get into it, be sure to like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content just like this. I'm currently working on a Void Titan build, so stay tuned for that in the near future. And let me know down in the comments what you thought of this build and any recommendations for future build guides. Thank you guys so much. I greatly appreciate your support. Let's get right into it. Getting right into the subclass then. For your abilities, you can use whichever rift you want. One is just for healing, one is for better weapon damage. It's really up to you. For your grenade though, I 100% recommend the Shackle Grenade. While you can truly use either with this build, between the Grapple, the Threadling Grenade, or the Shackle Grenade, the Shackle provides a unique effect when combined with our aspect that is 100% key to the chaining potential of this build, even when not using Strand weapons. That chaining effect comes from Mindspun Invocation. In short, when you consume your Shackle Grenade, you get Weaver's Trance, which is one of the best abilities in the entire game. Weaver's Trance is a 25-second buff that allows you to get an AoE suspending burst upon getting any final blow, and this can come from your weapons, your abilities, or your super, and this is key to actually chaining the unraveling, suspending, and threadling generation effects that this build has, even when not using a Strand weapon. The ability to chain these effects comes from our exotic armor, as well as our other aspect for today, which is the Wanderer. In short, whenever you throw a tangle or shoot a tangle and detonate it, it'll release an AoE suspending blast, and threadling final blows can help generate these tangles. In short, as we destroy tangles, we get additional threadlings, and these threadlings, thanks to our exotic, can also unravel targets. As these targets take additional weapon damage, more and more threadlings are generated. As we get kills, AoE suspending bursts are released, suspending nearby enemies. More and more enemies that are killed this way can also release more threadlings and unravel more targets, releasing more suspending bursts and killing more enemies. This chaining effect can become even stronger when combined with Strand weapons, but the nice thing with this build is you don't have to use Strand weapons if you don't want to, and still have similar effects achieved automatically. Because again, the best thing about this build is all of these effects are going on in the background. It's not something you have to keep an uptime timer for, it's not something you have to manage or work around. You simply destroy tangles, you simply get kills and consume your grenade when you have it, and all this will naturally happen on its own. For fragments to support this build, the first one is Thread of Evolution. This is simply going to enhance their threadling damage as well as their travel distance they can actually do to target an enemy. The nice thing about this is that threadlings recently had their damage brought up to the previous baseline with Thread of Evolution, meaning that it now offers a much higher damage bonus than it typically did at the start of Lightfall, so this is a great addition to this build. I'm also using Thread of Rebirth, which allows any of our Strand weapons to occasionally generate a threadling, essentially giving each Strand weapon a pseudo hatchling perk. The one thing about this though is that if you're not using a Strand weapon with this build, you can always take this off and have a replacement, which I'll go over some recommendations for alternative fragments in a second. The next one is Thread of Continuity, which allows us to have an increase in our duration for suspending and unraveling effects. And if you want to use a weapon with Slice or use something like the Navigator, you can also enhance your severing effects as well. The final one is Thread of Warding, which anytime you pick up an Orb of Power, it grants you Woven Mail. Woven Mail is still one of the best effects in the entire game, and even though it got a recent reduction in its damage resistance, when we're combining this with our tier 10 Resilience, which is a 30% damage resistance, as well as intrinsic healing provided on the Warlock subclass, it's still one of the best effects in the entire game, and its stacking potential is fantastic. Plus, when you use the weapon combination that I'm going with, you can also apply Devour with this build, meaning that this build has some fantastic survivability with really low investment. In case you want to swap out any of these fragments though, some alternatives I would recommend include Thread of Mind. This allows us to generate a little bit of class energy every time we defeat a suspended target, which can help regen our rift very quickly with this build. I'd also recommend using Thread of Generation. Moving on to the artifact mods, I want to point out that you don't have to use any of the artifact mods that I'm mentioning here. I am going to recommend a few that are more crucial to the core aspect of this build, but in truth, you can use whichever ones best fit your playstyle or the weapons you choose, essentially since this build has no weapon restrictions. So just keep that in mind as you're making this build your own. The ones I'm personally going with though are first going to be Flint Striker. Essentially getting rapid precision hits with a solar weapon or getting rapid solar weapon final blows will grant you Radiant. This is how we're actually applying Radiant on a Strand subclass, and it's going to give us a 25% damage boost to our weapons. The next mod is Torch, which is just another quality of life mod for this build. Again, it's not something you need, but if you want to get the most out of your weapon damage support, this is something that is mandatory with this build. While you're Radiant, you deal increased weapon damage to combatants affected by Strand and Stasis debuffs, which for us is basically going to be Unraveling, as we can very easily and automatically apply Unraveling to basically any target in a room with this build. This grants us an additional 5% weapon damage to these enemies, which on its own isn't a lot, but when we combine this with Surge's and Radiance effect, it's incredibly powerful. I'm also pairing this with Unraveling Orbs, which anytime we pick up an Orb of Power and grant us Woven Mail, it'll also grant us Unraveling rounds, and this allows any Strand weapon to apply Unraveling automatically. Again, this isn't something you need to use with this build, but it is something that's going to enhance any Strand weapons you use with it. Because keep in mind, our Threadlings are automatically applying Unraveling. This is just a nice manual way to do so without wasting your melee charge. I'm also pairing this with Dragon's Bite, which allows any combatant with its shield broken with a Strand or Stasis weapon to suspend or freeze. In our case, it'll suspend them automatically, and this chance can escalate the more and more Season of the Wish armor you have currently equipped. Again, it's a nice quality of life effect that isn't necessarily needed, but allows us to have another way to suspend enemies. I'm also pairing this with Horde Shuttle, which allows any unraveled target to generate a Threadling anytime it's damaged by a weapon. The nice thing about this is it's by weapon damage total, it's not a periodic effect, meaning that if you can put out a lot of weapon damage very quickly, you can generate a ton of Threadlings. Stuff like LMGs, rocket launchers, and grenade launchers do really well with this build, but even something like a Strand Bow or even the new exotic bow can do this basically on hit every single time you get a precision hit. Again, it's a nice quality of life effect, and the fact that it's not limited to Strand weapons and it's just weapon damage in general allows you to take advantage of this basically automatically with this build. And again, any Threadlings that are generated by this not only unravel targets, but can get suspending AoE effects on kill, and can even generate more Threadlings, as Threadlings that are generated via weapon damage are actually weapon intrinsic effects, meaning that if you have a weapon with Hatchling, if you get something with like Thread of Rebirth, or if you do weapon damage to actually generate a Threadling with this, when it deals damage, if it meets that damage threshold, it can just generate another Threadling. And the final mod is really up to you, but I'm personally going with Solo Operative, and I highly recommend this being mandatory if you're taking this build into solo content. Basically, all damage that you do, that's weapon damage, ability damage, and super damage, is buffed by 15%. But again, keep this in mind, you can use any artifact mod with this build depending on your own weapon loadout and playstyle, so feel free to play around with this and swap some different perks out based on your own weapon combination, because again, you can literally use any kind of weapon with this build and still have similar effects. Getting into the armor mods then for today. Starting off, I have a stack of Special Ammo Finder and Heavy Ammo Finder. Just because this build is so weapon focused rather than ability chaining focused, it allows us to support our heavy and special weapon a lot more and increase ammo drops for them. I'm also pairing this with a Solar and Strand Dual Siphon to support the weapon selection that I have. Just keep this in mind, based on your own weapon selection, you're going to want to change this out based on whatever weapons you have and their elemental affinity. Next up, onto our gauntlets. I'm personally using 2 stacks of Impact Induction. This allows us to have a little bit more grenade energy regen anytime we deal damage with our melee. Again, this is reducing the downtime between Weaver's Trance running out and us not having our grenade, and helps us chain the effects of this build a lot more fluidly. I'm also using Harmonic Loader to benefit the reload speed of our Strand weapons. However, keep in mind, based on your own weapon selection and what direction you want to take this build based on your weapon loadout, you can change these around to best fit your own playstyle and your affinity of weapons. For a chest piece, it's really up to you. I think a combination of reserves and resist is the best choice for this build. 2 resist mods and a reserve is what I'm going with to benefit our Strand weapons while having some additional survivability, but again, depending on your activity and your own weapon selection, feel free to swap this out. Next up onto our boots, and our exotic for today is Swarmers. These are a very simple Strand exotic that allows for a lot of chaining potential with Strand Warlock. In short, what it does is anytime you destroy a Tangle, either by throwing it or shooting it, it'll spawn an additional Threadling, and anytime that you have Threadlings deal damage to a target, it'll automatically unravel that target. Again, when combined with our artifact mods, this allows our Threadlings to not only self-generate if they do enough damage to an already unraveled target, but it also allows us to chain these effects very easily, because it adds a new way for us to apply Unraveling that isn't dependent on an artifact mod. It'll just do it in the background automatically. Even in higher difficulty content, with how many we're generating, it allows us to simply mow through an entire horde of adds very easily, and since these effects are automatic and we don't have to manually apply them or anything, it enables us to focus on our weapon damage and focus on specific targets, as our Threadlings and our chaining effect basically takes care of them for us. For the mods on Swarmers though, I'm personally going with 2 Strand Weapon Surges. This is just simply benefiting the weapons I primarily want to focus on with this build. Swap this out based on the elemental affinity of your preferred weapon. And I'm also using Elemental Charge. This will simply grant us an escalating chance of getting an Armor Charge stack anytime we pick up a Fire Sprite, an Ionic Trace, a Stasis Shard, a Void Breach, or in our case, a Strand Tangle is destroyed. And again, we can destroy it by either throwing it or shooting it, and not only can this potentially grant us a stack of Armor Charge, but it can also generate a Threadling, which again helps the entire chain keep going. Finally, onto our Bond. The first mod I'm using is Reaper, which allows us to have a guaranteed overpower generation anytime that we use our class ability on our next final weapon blow. I'm pairing this with Powerful Attraction, which allows any time that we use our class ability to automatically pick up any nearby orbs of power. The nice thing about Powerful Attraction with this build is it automatically lets us pick up that orb of power to give us Unraveling Rounds and Woven Mail, as well as activating our armor charge effects like Strand Weapon Surge without actually leaving cover and still being in our rip. The final mod is Time Dilation, which just simply increases the duration of these armor charge effects for Strand Weapon Surge from 10 seconds to 15 seconds. It's just a nice quality of life bonus that allows us to have these effects active for a little bit longer. Moving on to the weapons I'd recommend for this build, I'm briefly going to go over the ones that I find primarily work best with this build, but I'm also going to give a bunch of recommendations in case you don't have them or don't want to use them. However, if you have a weapon that you personally want to use with this build or personally enjoy that I didn't list, just simply use it. Again, most things with Strand Warlock are happening in the background, so this allows you to free up any kind of mod support or artifact support to the weapons you want to use, while Strand Warlock is simply working with basically anything. I really wanted to enhance the Strand Threadling aspect of this build just because I personally enjoy it, so one of the best weapons I have found to do with that is Round Robin. This is one of the best Strand primaries in the entire game, and recently hand cannons got a massive buff in PvE, which turns this thing into a monster in endgame content. I personally have enhanced subsistence and hatchling on it, which allows this thing to generate a ton of threadling on its own, especially when combined with stuff like the artifact mods and Thread of Rebirth. And with things like enhanced subsistence, it allows me to basically never reload this weapon, as I'm killing adds in 1 or 2 hits anyway, and I'm getting back basically the same ammo I put into them every single time. But again, any Strand weapon can work. For other weapon alternatives though, again, literally any of them works, but for Strand focus, I recommend things like Rufus's Fury, Incisor, or Vengeful Whisper. I'm actually recording this right before the exotic bow drops, so if you want to use the exotic bow after this video comes out, that'll work just fine as well, and also enhance our suspending effects as well as threadling generation. For power weapons, I would recommend basically the same, anything that you personally find really good for subclass synergy or chaining different effects. For Strand, I'm using Caraxus's Distress with an Envious Assassin and Surrounded roll. This allows me to output a ton of damage very quickly when surrounded by enemies, and it's something I found that works really well with this build, while also taking advantage of its own intrinsic damage effects and stacking surge effects on top of it, while also generating a ton of threadlings. As far as how other heavy weapons go, any solar weapon is particularly going to be very strong with this build. Just because of the artifact mods, it enables us to get Radiance effect on top of our own additional weapon damage bonuses. Stuff like the Unwavering Duty or the Avalanche, which is available through the Dawning event, are fantastic because these solar LMGs can grant us Radiant after getting a few kills or even just hitting a few precision hits. But again, with this in mind, use anything that best fits your subclass. Onto the exotics, which are arguably the biggest factor for what weapon you want to take in with this build. The first one I would recommend is Buried Bloodline. Now, the thing with Buried Bloodline is it is the dungeon exotic, so if you don't have this, you don't need it for this build, but it is something I think fits very well into it, so I'm going to showcase it. The nice thing about this is after getting a few kills, it'll grant you Devour, and anytime you get a kill while Devour is active, it'll just give you a huge chunk of your health back. And the nice thing about Violent Reanimation is it's not like the artifact effect that grants you Radiant, where the timer will just simply reach 0 as you're getting solar kills and has to be reprocced unless you're on a solar subclass. Devour will simply refresh itself up to 10 seconds as you get kills, meaning that once you get a few kills with this weapon and Devour is active, you don't have to use it ever again if you don't want to. Devour is active as long as you're getting kills. And since so many things are happening in the background automatically with this build, it's very easy to keep Devour's effect going, and helps with the survivability of this build immensely. On top of this, if you have the Catalyst like I do, while Devour is active, you also weaken targets on hit, allows us to apply a 15% debuff onto targets, which enhances our weapon damage even further. Again, you don't need this exotic for this build, but if you have it, I think it's one of the best options. Again, if you don't have Buried Bloodline, it's not the end for you. You can use literally any weapon for this build. It's just one that I find I personally enjoy. Some alternatives to it though include stuff like Sunshot, which is already a monster in PvE in terms of ad clear. What this build does with Sunshot is basically anything that isn't killed by its AoE explosion will be suspended for you, and this also allows you to chain Radiant very easily, as Sunshot is a monster in terms of ad clear. Some other weapons I enjoy are things like Ariana's, which is a special weapon alternative that also has some endgame viability with automatic anti-barrier effects, and again, this can also chain Radiant effect just by getting precision hits or multi-kills. Vex Mythic class recently got a buff that has made it a monster in PvE and is a fantastic choice for the same reasons. Something like Dead Messenger is also a craftable exotic grenade launcher, which can specialize in a ton of ad clear and also roll with Void, Arc, or Solar, so this can also proc Radiant effects on getting multi-kills, and can also be rolled with Demolitionist, enabling you to have some intrinsic grenade regen coming from this weapon on its own. For heavy weapons, my other favorites include stuff like Two-Tailed Fox, which allow us to have some additional subclass effects with this build. With Two-Tailed Fox, not only can we suppress enemies, but also jolt and scorch them, and this allows us to basically take an effect from almost every subclass in the game with this build and apply it onto a single enemy. In addition, stuff like Dragon's Breath, which is the seasonal exotic, are fantastic with this build. The nice thing with Dragon's Breath is since it's a background function as it deals damage, you can unravel a target and then apply Dragon's Breath to it, and it will continually proc Threadlings as it deals damage. But again, I can't stress this enough, any weapon works fantastic with this build. Specifically with the artifact mods, any solar, stasis, or strand weapon has additional functionality, but you can really use anything. Again, I'm using buried bloodline, which is a void weapon, and this allows me to proc devour on a strand subclass. Pairing this with a solar weapon allows me to also proc radiant on a strand subclass, but you can use stuff like stasis, you can use arc, you can use void, solar, strand. It really doesn't matter. Any weapon is going to have a great fit with this build. No matter what weapon you choose, you can have a variety of different effects all stacking on top of each other and working in tandem. For example, if you have an arc weapon with jolting, your thread links not only apply unraveling to a target, but also reproc stuff like the jolting effect, which can reproc the unraveling effect in return. The possible combinations and different effects you can stack on with this build are really limitless and are only limited by your own imagination and what personally you want to rock with this build. Again, with mine, I have Devour and Radiant on top of everything else Strand Warlock does incredibly well, but your own build can do a ton of different effects and achieve basically anything that you would want to. In short, guys, that's the build for today. Like I just said, it is one of the most customizable and fun builds I've ever made, and with this season in particular, it allows it to have a variety of different subclass effects all in one, while also having the fantastic background of the Strand Warlock kit. On top of our great weapon support, which can be enhanced by things like Radiant or a weakening effect, it also has great survivability with intrinsic woven mail and healing effects coming from a Warlock kit, while also using stuff like Devour from Buried Bloodline. Again, even without Devour's effect, this build has great survivability, and is something I 100% would recommend for basically all levels of content, GMs and master raids included. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, I'm also working on a Void Titan build, so stay tuned for that. And let me know down in the comments for any recommendations you might have for future build guides, or anything you might want to see work for a specific subclass or exotic. As always, thank you guys so much for watching the video. I greatly appreciate your continued support on these, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thank you so much, and have a great day.